Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Construction Contract Administration Practice Session. Before we get started with today's topic, which is a continuation of our series that we've been doing for the better part of 2017, I just wanted to remind everyone a couple of housekeeping issues. So today's session will be recorded and posted to that channel at youtube.com/CSIConstruction. And check for that recording probably later on this week. Additionally, if you've missed any other of the previous 7 or 8 in this series, those have all been posted and are available to view on the website as well. With that, again, reminder everybody, feel free to answer your questions and comments directly into that question box, and I'll hand it over to Doug and Jim to get started with today's topic. So Doug and Jim, over to you.
I am tickled to have Doug Freeman on the call with us to talk about quality control and quality assurance, and wanted to give Doug a minute to shout out and tell everybody hello.
Hello to everyone. It's good to be back on the calls. I have been busy at work and haven't been able to participate, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to be back again.
It's always better when Doug's in the pilot's chair, I'll tell you that. We're going to talk about quality assurance and quality control today, and Matthew, you can go to the next slide. One of the things that I use in this series of conversations is to just get people to stop and think for a second. The last time you went clothes shopping and you put on a pair of new pants and stuck your hand in the pocket, what did you find? Well, you found a little sliver of paper that said inspected by number 6. I don't know who number 6 is. This is a busy human being all over the earth inspecting clothes. And my point in bringing that up is you think about the exposure a company manufacturing clothing has for a pair of pants or a shirt, a blouse or a jacket. And think about the quality control and quality assurance procedures that they have in place for just that one pair of pants. Yet many of you have worked in large engineering, large construction, large architectural firms, or for big owners, and find that your firm, your office, does not have a process for quality assurance and control. And think about the exposure difference for an architectural firm and what might occur versus that simple pair of trousers. So let's go to the next slide, Matthew. And Doug, I'll say a few things to introduce this slide, and then I'll hush and give you a chance to jump in here. But we're talking about assurance and control. Well, what are these things, and how do we differentiate? Quality assurance in a firm is a program of procedures to discover the deficiencies or defects that may exist, and that can occur before or that can occur during the execution of the work. So there are tools to provide quality assurance like submittals, certifications, any kind of actions that are assuring that products are proper and that the services are being provided as they should be. Where quality control are procedures for evaluating completed activities or elements of the work itself, overall conformance. Quality control can include testing and inspections, and it is potentially the finding and correcting of issues, unsatisfactory work, or performance that has occurred. We often think of quality assurance as something that the owner and the consultant do early in the project and during construction, where the control may be more contractor-centered, and so the contractor is managing the control process, the owner is monitoring the assurance process, or the owner's consultant. But it's not totally defined in that way. And Doug and Matthew and I were just talking about that before we got on the call, because one of our participants sent in a question and an item for us to discuss about this very item of quality assurance and quality control. So as we go through the slides, I hope that some of that will become more clear as we look at them. But Doug, I'll hush for a second and let you jump in.
Well, oftentimes I hear quality assurance and quality control being used interchangeably. I really don't get too particular about the terminology. I think the end result or the goal is what should be the main focus. I'm hearing about a bunch of static. I don't know if that's me or someone else.
I'm not picking it up, Doug.
Okay, well, I'll keep going then. So again, I think the end result that is the key, and I don't get too hung up on the terminology if someone's saying it's assurance versus control. I don't know that really matters that much when what you're trying to do is to get a good quality product in the end. One way of thinking of the two different terms and something that I've used in the past is that quality assurance is a way of preventing mistakes and quality control is a way of catching mistakes. So I don't know if that helps anybody in their understanding of the difference between the two. Matthew,
Doug, say that one more time. Matthew, you can go to the next slide, but Doug, will you say that one more time? Control is the catching.
Quality assurance is a way of preventing mistakes, and quality control is a way of catching mistakes. So you were talking about testing being something that's done during quality control. If you have poured concrete or sprayed fireproofing and you go back and you're doing a test, that's a way of catching something that's already been done and finding out you've got an issue and dealing with it. Quality assurance is a way of preventing mistakes. In construction, let's say that you get a submittal and you're reviewing a submittal. You're looking at something before it's in place, and so you're trying to catch it. So you're trying to prevent the mistake before it's actually been put in place. Does that make sense?
Makes great sense to me, and is sort of what is spelled out here on this next slide. And also is an example of maybe how these are used interchangeably so often. But let's perhaps, Matthew, let's stop right there and see if there are any hands raised or any questions at this point.
So far, we're quiet, except for Lauren pointing out my typo on the title of the last slide.
Good job, nice catch there. Well, I don't want to share because I didn't ask before we started about the communication earlier before we got started today, but perhaps that participant will raise his hand and have a chance to go into some conversation about his perspective on control and assurance, because I think it's really important to hear, and I thought it was a really good comment that we got before we got started. But while we're doing that, Matthew, go ahead to the next slide, and I hope that those of you that have participated with me don't find this too corny, but I just continue to be focused on examples of where there are quality control or quality assurance programs out there, and the magnitude of the exposure or the magnitude of the cost. Yes, sure, there are maybe hundreds of thousands of pairs of these shoes, but you see right there on the box that they've checked it in various phases of manufacture, and there it is. Quality control passed these, and they're in good shape to sell. So I can't say enough about finding a program that fits in your organization, in your practice, in your company, on your sites, where you're working, and get that program in place. And as Doug has often said in the past, when you find that right program and you do implement it, then you need to be sure that you follow it. And maybe, Doug, you want to add more in detail about that, but this is just a reminder slide of how simple a program can be and how pervasive they are in other industries.
Well, if you have identified a program or a system that you say that you're going to use in your office, and you've got that documented, and then you don't follow it, I certainly wouldn't want to have to be the one that goes in front of the jury to try to explain why we didn't follow our own program. So, as Jim just mentioned, if you have one, make sure you follow it on every project, because you don't want to be the one that has to sit in that witness box and get grilled by that attorney on the other side, and you haven't done what you have committed or said you were going to do within your own office.
That's right.
Let's go to the next slide.
We actually have a couple of comments and questions that have popped in here quick. So we have a comment come in here from Dean Bortz saying, to me, QC is often QA for the next step. Another key for me is observe versus inspect, especially as it affects continual contractual obligations and liability issues. And then we have a question here from Lufty asking, do QA and QC overlap at some cases?
Well, I'll jump in with something quick and say, yes, I think so. I think that, for example, once work moves into the field, there are possibilities of you finding control things that are pointed out as a designer and engineer that are pointed out to the construction community. Maybe not your obligation or requirement for assurance, but certainly through communication of a job site observation, you might share that information. As has been pointed out in previous calls, we're on the design side not responsible for means and methods, and quality control is very much connected to means and methods. So I think that's one of those places where it's fuzzy and there isn't a clear start and stop, that they do bleed over. Doug, what do you think?
I agree. I think they bleed over. Again, I don't get too hung up on the terms quality control versus quality assurance. I think the end objective is what everyone should be focused on. And whether I'm doing quality control or doing quality assurance, as long as I'm doing what I need to do to make sure that we're going to end up with a quality project, that's my focus. But I do think they can overlap. The submittal example, I think, is a example of where they kind of overlap, because when you're reviewing the submittal, you're checking to make sure it complies with the documents. That's a procedure to help prevent mistakes before they happen in the field. But it's also a way of catching something that someone may have mistaken or made a mistake on when they were submitting or putting the submittal together. So I think there's overlap between the two.
That's a good point. Matthew, as you go to the next slide and check for questions, I'll just say both of those start with quality, and I think that's what Doug is saying, that's what your focus is. And it's a good. Go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, I was just going to follow. We had a similar line of question that I think we're starting to talk about. Just wanted to clarify and get it out there. Saying, can quality assurance occur during physical construction, or is this activity always considered quality control at that point?
I think it occurs during construction as well. I think just because that it's being done by the contractor, Jim has mentioned, we had a brief conversation before we got on the call. I don't think that quality assurance is done just by the designer and quality control is just done by the contractor. I think we both do quality control and quality assurance. And there are procedures that contractors have in place when they're building a building to make sure or to help them in preventing mistakes being made. It could be having a second set of eyes review the form work. You know, they have a carpenter go out and he does form work, and then they have the project superintendent. He goes behind him and he looks at the form work to make sure it's in compliance. That's a quality assurance process that's done during construction.
That's right, isn't it? So if we, Matthew, you interrupt me as I look ahead here at this slide, but it also, quality, whether we're talking about the assurance or the control, is affected by the particular participants that are involved with the project. So again, Doug and I focus on predominantly design, bid, build as a basis for these webinars, and in that process, you don't get to pick who your team members are. So being aware that there is an effect on this, depending on the individual participants, is something that is a part of what I think you have to consider while you're on the job, on the site, or within the portion of the project that is the submittals coming through your hands. These items are really defined in Division 1 in the general requirements as far as how we are associated with quality, but you know, our role as designers, as engineers and architects, is to verify that the required quality of the work is what the owner is receiving, and that should we see any deviation or departure from that we inform the owner, and that we are also there to answer questions about what the intent was, that should be clear in the documents, but may be requested by the contractor from start to finish. What was the intent here? And this also affected by the amount of time that we are involved on the site in the construction administration phase. So there are projects and clients that perhaps don't have the designer as involved as others. And then, of course, there are those cases where there is someone selected to be there full time through some sort of enhanced service, where there may be, you may be represented on the job site every day during construction. So participants can also affect the program that you put in place for your firm. And this list continues on the next slide, and you can go there, Matthew, and then let me pause and see if there are any questions so far, or Doug, if you want to add anything there.
Nothing to add here. Let's see if the audience has anything.
Yeah, we had two comments / questions come in here. One from, as a specifier, isn't QC relying upon information from manufacturers to be clear, concise, complete, and correct? So I'll stop with that question first.
Well, I'll jump in.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Doug, I'll reread it. As a specifier, isn't QC relying upon information from the manufacturers to be clear, concise, complete, and correct?
I wanted to jump in, Doug, and say first, I think that much of what we do relies on the manufacturers, and I certainly I want to let Doug address that, but I would just like to share a really brief story of an engineer that I worked with on a project who I guess this is one of those chapters that isn't in the practice guide called Trust Your Gut. He was working in an area that was a high wind zone and just didn't feel like the information provided in the manufacturer's printed material. And I'll say that I bet you 90% of the people on this call would recognize the name of the product if I said it. He just didn't trust it. He completely redid their calculations and found that they were wrong, and that there was a part of their requirements that were underestimated. Contacted the manufacturer, went through the due diligence process of describing what he had done and what they had done, and in fact they changed their data for the all of the information they put out after that project. So I've never heard of that before. I've never thought about going through the manufacturer's data, but he just didn't feel like it was right, and he had no other thing to quote except it just didn't feel right to him. But Doug, I'll hush and let you jump in there.
Well, we do rely on the information that we get from manufacturers as well as the information we get from other sources. But I think, as Jim's example that he just gave, I think that you do have to go by your gut a lot, your gut feel, your experience, things that you've learned over the course of your career. So I don't think it's just a blanket. You get something from whether it's a manufacturer or an engineer or whoever, and you just always blindly trust that it's going to be correct, because people do make mistakes.
There was a quick comment in here from John regarding your story saying, hopefully he sent them an invoice and was paid for his time.
I love it. I love the way you think, John. That's right. I don't think he did, but he should have. You're right.
And then we had another follow-up question asking, isn't an effective QA/QC the ability of the AE to disallow a subcontractor with a poor record of performance?
Ooh.
That's an excellent question. And I would think that is a part of this quality assurance, quality control, quality management process. The AIA documents do, in the general conditions, permit the designer or the owner to object to subcontractors. And if a subcontractor is proposed that has a bad track record for not doing good work, then I think that if the designer or the owner were to object and say, no, you can't use him, that is a part of that whole quality process, that quality management system.
It really is, and there may be examples that a piece of the project is so important that owners might designate, which is a whole different kind of bidding process, but they may have requirements for certain subs or require the contractors to list those subs in an effort to not have to go through that. But it's a great point, and often we say they have to have this kind of experience and they have to have done these kinds of jobs or this scale or scope of project, and they've got to document that and prove it, and that comes in, as Doug was describing, in a submittal. So it does seem to me, too, it would be a part of that process. Any others, Matthew?
This is a comment that came in here and said, usually the owner's decision.
Right, depending on the type of project and the type of delivery method, it certainly can be. But, this continuing how individual participants may affect the quality. The general contractor and the people that they assign to the site, whether that be project managers, foremen, superintendents, whoever, assistant superintendents and assistant project managers, they're of course affecting quality by becoming assured of aware of the site, what particular components of the site and how work is connected to those components. They're supervising everything. So they are performing quality control at all parts and all phases of all activities of the construction. Of course, as we just been talking about, the manufacturers and suppliers affect the quality by the initial product that they send from the source, and also through their preparation of documents and what the submittal process reveals as we go through it and as the contractor goes through it. And then there are the testing agencies that are there verifying compliance through particular inspections like sprayed-on fireproofing, et cetera, where they are enforcing a code and as well as our specified requirements within the contract documents. So the summation about this is there are participants involved, and they too are a part of our team on a project and a part of the team that we should be aware of and what their abilities and what their effects will be on quality. So Matthew, let's go to the next slide while Doug adds anything or you have any questions.
No other questions at this time.
Okay, well, so in reference particularly to the practice guide on page 136, there is an explanation, a list of items or examples of what might mean quality assurance. And as Doug pointed out, some of these words relate right back to what he said, where you're verifying site conditions, reviewing documents, correlating solutions to certain contract requirements, scheduling, which would be the contractor's responsibility for implementation of the construction itself, but may be the architect or engineer's responsibility for processing submittals and paperwork within the office. Assurance measures are meeting to resolve conflicting matters, perhaps submitting evidence of quality products where something may not be right within the site itself or what was installed, and obtaining the manufacturer's certifications in perhaps the closeout phase of the project. So here is a reference to what we sort of started talking about in the very beginning, where the designer may do quality assurance in the design phase, the general contractor in the planning, scheduling, and the meeting of standards phase. There is an example of the separation of design versus construction and designer versus contractor. And then yet the designer performs quality control in the construction phase as well. As Doug pointed out, and as we began the conversation, looking at the completed work, and certainly in the rejection of work that's not in compliance, as is a part of the service that we provide in the CA phase. Now we can go right to the next slide, and it'll be a slide of quality control, and perhaps we want to do that, and then Doug, I'll be quiet, and maybe we can flip back and forth between these, Matthew, and catch any questions or raised hands all at once. And then the quality control process is on the next page in the practice guide, and examples of comparing items to acceptable standards, being sure the work is within a range of tolerance, and monitoring the contract requirements and whether they've been met. Anything that is substantiating those requirements, monitoring that, and that would include the testing and inspecting. And that would be generally what the general contractor's role in quality control would be. Testing agencies are also a part of that in their inspection and verification and their testing. Of course, they're measuring against a known standard for manufacturers' information. They distribute their results widely across the team, including those authorities having jurisdiction. While they don't have authority to act, they're reporting, and it, of course, does not relieve the responsibility from the general contractor of doing their part in quality control. The contractor has to, of course, meet the contract documents requirements, and we know that should installed pieces, parts, products, components not be at the standard they're supposed to be, then correcting that and repairing that falls as a cost to the contractor. Before something is removed and redone, often there may be a back check, and certainly the contractor has opportunities to go back and look before taking some corrective measure. But these are examples of what quality control may be versus quality assurance. I'll hush.
Any questions?
We have a comment and a question here. So I'll do the comment first here. One area I have found GC have fallen short is QA/QC of submittals from subs before signing off on them. I would agree that I've seen that, and it seems as though it gets worse and worse on each project. I can recall getting submittals that had nothing to do with the project that they were submitted on, and having to send them back. According to the general conditions, the contractor is required to review and approve, and I'm using AIA contract language. They are to review and approve the submittals prior to submitting them to the architect. And oftentimes I have returned them because it was obvious that they were not reviewed by the contractor before they sent them to me. So that is an issue that we have to deal with.
I want to, before we move off that, because it's a really good point, and we have had various webinars centered around submittals, and there are a few things that Doug has shared before that I think are bear repeating in a really, really good advice. For example, if you receive, as he just described, submittals that have nothing to do with the project, or let's say they do relate to the project, but they aren't a submittal that you have asked for nor that you require, Doug has said, wrap them up and send them back. Don't keep a copy, send the whole package back. And on your transmittal, say you've returned all of the copies, you've retained none because they are not required or have nothing to do with your project, no action taken. So that you have a document, a piece of proof that you notified the contractor of that, and they are so unimportant that you didn't even keep a copy. And the second piece of that, we've often talked about what within submittals are required by your contract documents. That propensity to just send us submittals seems often to be tied to a statement like this: my contract with my subcontractor is contingent on me signing off on this submittal. said the contractor. So because I got it, I sent it to you, and you need to take action. Well, that's not really necessarily so, is it, Doug?
No, it's not. Just because the contractor has agreed in his contract that he's going to review the submittals from the subcontractor doesn't obligate the architect to. If the architect has not asked for that submittal, I would say the architect should not review it. And as Jim said, wrap it up, document it, and send all of them back. No action taken, not a requested submittal. And Jim, as you were talking, I thought of another point. And again, the general conditions state that the contractor is to review and approve the submittals. So I will tell a brief story. I had received a submittal on a project, and the contractor had his stamp on the submittal and had checked off that he had reviewed it. There was nothing on his stamp that said anything about approving it. So I wrapped it up, sent it back to him, and says, you have to review and approve it. And he calls me up and says, well, my stamp doesn't say approved, it just says reviewed. What do you want me to do, get another stamp? And I said, yeah, either get another stamp or you can handwrite it on there, so you need to do something to indicate that you have approved the submittal before you send it to me. So I was holding him to his contractual obligations of reviewing and approving the submittal. That's what he signed the contract to do. That's what I was holding him to do. Oftentimes I've seen people trying to avoid liability, even architects that will have odd language on their review stamps that tries to get around taking responsibility and thus liability for submittals. But I would also say that if your contract says that you are to review and approve it, if you have not rejected it or marked it no comments noted, or if you give some kind of indication that you don't have any negative comments on it and you're sending it back through, you may be implied or interpreted or deemed by the law to have reviewed and approved it, because that's what your contract says you were supposed to do. So all that language that folks try to put in these stamps to avoid liability may not, in a court, do them much good. I've had other attorneys tell me the same thing. If you are contractually obligated to review it and approve it, and you send it back and you just say reviewed or you just say no exception taken, that's going to be deemed to have been an approval. Matthew, you said you had another question.
Yeah, we had a comment first came in here again from John. He's always bringing the humor, saying you should pack him up and you should return it with prejudice. So he's taking up that further. But we did have a question. I'm not sure if y'all are going to be able to handle it. Not sure what your expertise in this area is, but could you address a government requirement for ISO 9001 compliance? How and why do we comply? And then specific secondary point is it relates to the Department of Energy.
I'm not familiar with that.
I think, and I may be wrong, but I think ISO 9000 is a quality assurance program that has been put together by some organization. And if you are in a contract where you're saying you're going to do that, then you need to do it. And I don't know exactly what it is. I would certainly want to look it up and find out what it is that I was committing to before I signed on the line to do that. But again, if it's something that you have contractually agreed to do, then you're obligated to do it. And if you don't, you're at risk. And probably both a negligence and a breach of contract claim.
And literally, as you were saying that, Douglas, David also punched in here saying, good point about risk avoidance during the review approval process could be interpreted as a breach of contract by either the architect or the GC. And Dean pops in here as just indicating ISO 9000 is a lot of paperwork.
It probably is.
Well, let's look at the next slide, Matthew. It's a quick one, and then we'll move on. Also, those involved in quality control involve the authorities having jurisdiction. They're determining the laws or whatever ordinances, requirements, regulations that are involved with a particular location. Often the testing services send them distribution of their reports so that they can follow up with more detail. And they are able to act on orders of public authority to take action on projects to include stopping work if there is something that they deem is life-threatening. And maybe there are other options that they can take as well. But this slide is just to remind the group that quality control involves people that are outside our contract as a designer, which is with the owner, or outside the general contractor, which is a contractor with the owner. You can take a look at the next slide, and I'll stop after that one. The point here is, whatever the program is, it is absolutely critical that you get that in place, and that you take very serious action about quality assurance and quality control before, during, and after the project. There is no reason to stop once it's bid or once it goes to construction, but is something that can happen on a continuous basis. And I want to get to the next slide and then I'll stop, which is just concurrent quality assurance and quality control. And Matthew, give you a chance to see if anything has been added, or Doug, any follow-up to any of that.
Follow up on the authority having jurisdiction. They do play a role in quality assurance and quality control. My preference would be for it just to be a demonstration to them that all of those actions have been taking place before they got there. Here in North Carolina, we have our local code officials. We have on state projects, the state construction office. And on some projects, we have DHSR that comes out and does their reviews of projects. And it really should be a demonstration of them that the systems are working properly, that everything has been installed the way it's was supposed to be. It should not be another, it shouldn't be considered a quality control process as part of the construction progress for the contractor and for the architect. It really should be more a demonstration to the authority having jurisdiction that the work has been done properly. I also oftentimes will, at a pre-construction conference, remind the contractors that the design team is not there to conduct quality control and quality assurance for the general contractor. They need to do that themselves. We're there as more of a safety net to help protect the owner, but the contractor, who is also a licensed professional, should be responsible for making sure that the work is proceeding in a quality manner. Just wanted to comment on that. Matthew, do we have anything?
Sure.
Or Jim, any follow-up?
Yeah, we have two comments that came in here. One question from John asking, in the legal realm, who is ultimately held responsible for QC? Is it the general contractor, or is this clear as mud?
In a typical lawyer response, it depends. And so often the case, it does depend on the facts and circumstances of the issue. We have the slide up here of someone pumping concrete. So what happens when the pump, the chute where the concrete is coming out of on the pump, is 10 feet above the placement point? And so you've got it falling, and as it's falling, it's separating, and so you're not getting the mix at the point of installation where it's supposed to be. And the architect's out there, and he's looking at it, and the GC's out there, and he's looking at his sub doing it. So whose responsibility is it? And I would think legally it's going to be all of them's responsibility, and all of them are going to be liable for it. If the architect's not there and he doesn't see it and it wasn't obligated to be on site, then it's not going to be the architect's responsibility or liability. So it depends on again on the facts and circumstances of the situation. But it could fall to any one or all.
Matthew, was there another?
Yeah, there was another question here. Came in from Brian. It says, doesn't the responsibility fall to whatever is established in the contract?
It does, but I don't think it just stops at the contract. As licensed professionals, designers, architects, engineers are obligated to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And that can go beyond just what is in the bounds of the contract that they've signed. I know Jim remembers a story of the architect that would ride by a construction site daily. It's an interesting project, and he's looking, and he might stop and get out and talk to folks, and lo and behold, something happens on the project site, and it wasn't even his project, and he gets pulled into the lawsuit because as a licensed professional, he has that legal duty and was involved enough, not necessarily involved in the work, but involved enough with his curiosity and stopping by and looking, that he should have seen something and noticed that it was an error or a safety issue. And as an architect, he had a duty to do something about it and didn't do it. So it's not just the bounds of the contract. I mean, again, as professionals, that duty goes beyond just your relationship with your owner and your relationship with the contractor. It reaches out to the general public.
And as this slide indicates, and as we've been talking about, that line being fuzzy, when you're doing quality control in one step, that might become quality assurance for a following step. So here they are, this example of manufacturing procedures that require checking a material into an assembly. So that's reviewing the contract requirements, and then once it's assembled, it may be tested in another way to see how it performs. So if you go to the next slide, within the practice guide, there's an example of what that photograph indicates, which is a concurrent quality assurance and quality control process, and it uses that placement of concrete as an example. So here, assemblies may cross over several different specification sections, and if independent testing is involved in those, then that is important to think about with quality assurance and control, particularly in keeping your specifications current, because many assemblies are updated annually, so you may need to go into your documents and change them. And those quality assurance provisions may be in part one of your general conditions, where the quality control provisions may be in part two of your specifications. So quality assurance in part one in the general portions of your specifications, quality control in part two within the particular products within your specifications. So that's just an example of that fuzzy line, again, between those two slides and an example that's in the practice guide. Let's jump to the next slide, and then Matthew, I'll pause and see if there are questions, or see, Doug, if you've got anything to add.
Any questions, Matthew?
Yeah, we actually had a comment that came in from Dean, and then a question that came in from David that's actually similar in tone. So, Dean states that he endeavors to set the tone for QA/QC, especially submittals, at the pre-construction meeting as to what others can expect from me as the timeliness and stringency. And then immediately thereafter, we got a question from David asking, how can the QA process be used to set the tone and expectations for the project team to work in a collaborative manner in a pre-con meeting, contract negotiations, etc.?
See, Doug, they don't even need us on the call. They're just answering this in between themselves. That's perfect. Yes and yes.
And then as a more specific statement here, Dean just wants everybody to know that you should note the increased stringency for silica exposure per OSHA 29 CFR 1926 and 1910 Gen Industry as to QA/QC. So I'll copy that comment into the chat box for everybody.
Jim and I have talked often about establishing the tone early on in the project at that pre-construction conference and building those relationships. A lot of times, at least has been my experience and Jim's as well, is that we are dealing with many of the same contractors, many of the same engineers, many of the same authorities having jurisdictions, and many of the same owners, in fact. And those relationships get established, and by establishing those relationships and having defined what the expectations are, people will know, and also by word of mouth, people will know what your expectations are, how strict you're going to be. And I think that even helps in this whole quality management process, because when you go into a project and you know, oh, this architect, he's going to be real strict on my submittals, I know I got to get them right. Or this owner is a real stickler for schedule. All of that knowledge, that information, those relationships all build into, I think, the whole quality management process. If you're going into a situation and one of the parties is unknown, then I think you really do need to up front establish what those expectations are and get everybody on the same page so that everybody can come together as a team to produce a good project.
That's exactly right. We're going to end basically with that as a slide, a few slides away from here. The title of this one actually should be Quality Assurance, and I apologize for that. Quality assurance is in the conditions of the contract, and we've talked about all this, and we've talked about examples of assurance and how the designer and or how the contractor are involved with each of those. And Matthew, if you go to the next slide, it should say quality control. And we've talked about where those conditions are described in the contract with the owner and what the contractor is responsible for in their role in that, but also how the designer becomes involved with that quality control piece through periodic visits, pay application certifications, for example, and monitoring of the work itself and whether we reject it as non-conforming. So again, that line remains fuzzy. But I wanted to get really to the next two slides, and I'll pause there, Matthew, to see if there's anything else that we should touch on before I go any further.
Yeah, there was just a question / clarification asking the contractor should have a quality control program submitted during the beginning of a project, correct?
I don't know that I've ever seen a quality control submittal, but I think it's certainly a great idea. Perhaps for them to be able to describe what their plan is in their organization, how they provide that portion of their contract requirement. I don't know. Have you ever seen anything like that, Doug?
I haven't ever seen it in terms of a submittal coming through, but I have certainly had contractors discuss it during interview processes when you're going through the selection process.
I think that's a great idea. Well, what Doug started talking about there a second ago is how teamwork makes all of this a undertakeable task. Being sure that your whole team understands that, as you folks have said, and setting the tone at the pre-construction conference for how you move forward and how you're going to interact with the team that's there, and continuing that process through the project, coordinating documents and all of the things that you've learned to do as a good designer. No reason that it has to stop when you go to construction if you have the ability and the time and the personnel to continue to do that. And our experience, both of us, is the more involved your owner is, the happier they are, the better informed they are, the better owner they become of the facility once it transfers over to their use. And so let's look at the next slide, Matthew, which is the final one of the presentation. And I'll just say this and then hush. But, you know, Doug and I also talk a lot about expectation management. Your owner needs to have realistic goals, and this quality control and assurance process becomes much more reasonable. Good budgets and good schedules. We've got to be qualified as designers for the project and the program type to deliver the service we're supposed to provide, and the same for the contractor. So when you have that right team of owner, designer, contractor, and you've got the right team on the site agreeing how they proceed from step one, you set yourself up best you can to have a good quality project in the end from all aspects. Doug?
I think that pretty much covers it. Any last comments or questions, Matthew?
No, I think we have covered it, and we are pretty much right at the hour. So I will throw it back to you to introduce next month, and we can close up the session.
I'll just jump in quick with this and let Doug close us out. Next month will be December the 19th, a week earlier, so that we finish up this year before the holidays really get in full swing. And we'll be looking at Chapter 8 in the practice guide, which is interpretations and modifications. So I'll look forward to all of you being back together with us, and wish you a great first part of December before we talk again. And Doug, it's over to you.
I just want to say it's good to be able to participate again, and I hope to be able to join in on these calls more often going forward.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim and Douglas, for today's session. And as Jim said, we look forward to seeing you next month. That invite will be going up probably within the next week or so.